Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this IMarEST webinar. Today we're going to cover how COVID-19 has reshaped the marine industry, and I'm joined by four exceptional panelists who are going to help me try and answer this question. We're going to sort of look around the world, around the marine industry, covering the transportation of goods, seafarers, the classification societies, and the cruise ship industry, and around technology as well. It's going to be an exciting debate today. If you have any questions, we've got the Slido tool, which is available for you to ask questions to us. But to begin with, I'm just going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and their organisation before we get into the first preliminary set of questions that I'll ask before I get into the questions from the audience. So first of all, near Southampton, I'm going to get Claire Peckham to introduce herself, please.
Hello, everybody, and I'm really looking forward to this session. I'm Claire Peckham. I'm a director of a specialist human factors consultancy called Safe Marine. And I'm a maritime psychologist by background, so I'll be talking about the plight of seafarers' mental well-being.
Thank you very much, Claire. Next, in Finland, we have Mattias Aronson.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you for inviting us. My name is, like said, Mattias Aronson. I am a Vice President Business Development for a company called Ship. We are marine engineers and naval architects. So anything related to the outlooks of a vessel in a way.
Thank you, Mateus. Next, we have Vasily Ozcanis, who's in London at the moment from ABS.
Hi, everybody. I'm Vasily Ozcanis. I'm Vice President for ABS, responsible for the business activities of ABS for Europe. My background is Master of Science in Mechanical Engineering, London Business School. I bring shipyard experience. I was for 8 years in Dubai as an ABS surveyor. I lived in Korea for 5 years building ships. I moved around a little bit, presently in London, as I said before. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vasilios. And a colleague of mine, a former colleague of mine, Mr. Andy McCarran, who's in Paris at the moment. Andy.
Thanks, Kevin. Our paths cross again, indeed. But so my name is Andy McCarran. I'm the commercial director for Lloyd's Register, and I'm in charge globally of the innovation, marketing, sales, and product developments.
That's great. Thanks very much, Andy. So as you can see, we've got a very diverse mix of people that will help us answer the question about how COVID-19 has changed the marine industry. So the first part of the webinar, I'm going to ask each of the panelists 2 questions. They're going to get questions bespoke for their particular area of the maritime. After they've answered their questions, I will talk a little bit about a topic of mine, which is around technology, before we then get into the questions that you raised. So remember, you can ask questions at any time using the Slido tool. So please fire away questions. Every question is valid. There are no silly questions. We will try and answer as many of them as possible. So to start with, I'm going to start with Claire first of all. So there's been a limited media coverage on the plight of seafarers around the world, particularly in the commercial sector. Can you provide us with an overview of the current situation?
Thank you. Yes, I'd be happy to give my perceptions of what's happening. So the principal impact of the COVID pandemic has been on crew exchanges and the lack of them. And also seafarers like us are people. And so they will have been affected, whether at sea or ashore, by anxiety to do with the virus and the well-being of themselves and their families. But also indirectly, their mental health will have been impacted by, certainly if they've been trapped on board, the extended separation from families and loved ones. So those are the key impacts that I see. There are others, of course. And so as a consequence, what's the situation? As a consequence, really, of the cancellation of flights and the restrictions on travel for everybody bar key workers, staff who are already on board or were already on board at the time that people were entering, countries were putting embargoes on people's travel, have not been relieved. And one of the sort of forgotten community are those that are ashore but can't join ships and therefore aren't able to earn because they only earn when they're on board. So that will be causing them distress. Normally, on a day-to-day basis, thousands of seafarers are exchanged, shall we say. And in the current situation, and I think it was probably, I was hearing reports of around March the 16th that all world crew changes had stopped. The situation has improved slightly, but if we think that thousands were moving every single day, we're now down to just handfuls. So the numbers are very low. Those that are happening, and they are starting to happen, they take considerable time and effort on the party of the shoreside people to arrange. So the consequence principally is that seafarers who were on board have been trapped on board since the outbreak. And for some, their contracts may have overrun by many months. Now, why is that an important issue? Since the introduction of the Maritime Labour Convention, seafarers have employment contracts. Companies are legally required to repatriate them before 12 months is up. And so many companies now are facing the situation where particularly the crew may have been on board for longer than 12 months. So in effect, companies are now breaking the law. And what has the community, the international maritime community, been trying to do about this? Well, they've tried several strategies. And the first was to try and get countries to recognize seafarers as key workers so that they had dispensation to travel. And I think that that has largely met with very limited success. I know the UK has recognised seafarers as key workers, but they're one of a few. They're in a minority. Also, Kitak Lim, the Secretary General of the IMO, has written to countries stressing their responsibilities in law to allow the passage of seafarers. But again, I think the success of those initiatives has been very limited. So we still face the situation where seafarers are stuck on board. And so in terms of giving this overview, we know from research, from very recent research, that before this situation happened, that significant numbers of seafarers in normal circumstances are suffering with mental ill health, and up to a quarter in some studies reporting seafarers suffering clinical levels of depression. So we know that this is a significant problem. And in the report that I mentioned, there's two very important things that are related to this lack of exchange. And the first is that a key cause of these levels of depression is separation from family. So they'll be suffering extended separation from family. And the second very important thing is that seafarers are most likely to experience an episode of mental ill health when their relief is delayed for whatever reason. So we can conclude from what's happening with the lack of exchange that we are at risk of jeopardizing or worsening seafarers' mental health.
Thank you, Claire. I guess you've sort of answered the next part of the question a little bit, about this presents an opportunity for the community to really look at the steps that are needed to be taken to make seafarers, and being at sea a better place to work. Is there any other steps you think could be taken, and by whom?
Yes. I've given this some thought. And coincidentally, I wrote an article for Maritime Chirp recently where I set out a number of factors that are likely to be causing distress in seafarers characteristics of their work that in ordinary times will cause problems, and what can companies do to mitigate those. But I'm going to focus on just three for now, and I believe these three, if systematically and purposefully addressed, could leverage some real improvements in seafarers' well-being. So the first is the length of employment contracts. The second is the physical working environment, and the third is the psychological working environment. So those of us that all work well versed in risk management, we know that the likelihood of suffering an injury is a function of the potency of the hazard to cause harm and the exposure to that harm, that hazard. So one of the ways I see that we could improve seafarers' well-being is to reduce their exposure to harm. And the length of service, the longer the length of service, the longer their exposure to these psychological harming factors. So, and I know that there are already calls in the maritime community to reduce the limit of the sea service to 6 months. Currently, people work up to 9 months legally on board. And in terms of the question that I've been posed in terms of who do I think should take these steps, well, I think this probably rests with the international maritime community at the legislative level, and probably the International Labour Organization. So I think that's the first key area that I think could be done. Secondly, the physical working environment. And anecdotally, seafarers have been telling me that it wouldn't be so bad to be trapped on board ship if ships were better places to live on. And so if we could afford them more habitable environments conducive to promoting their well-being, then I think that would go a long way to help. Over recent decades, we've seen the erosion of living space on board. So no more swimming pools, no bars anymore. So the spaces where they can interact reduced. Gyms that are provided, maybe just like a cupboard with an antiquated piece of equipment on board. So I think my call is to the naval architectural community to radically rethink the design of living spaces on board ships. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, is to address the prevalence of distress and suffering. And I think we need an equivalent of the ISM code for mental health, and a code that impresses upon ship operators the legal duty to manage seafarers' well-being. And I think what we need are the management systems that we have in place to manage safety, that promote policies that promote mental well-being, management actions that ensure mental health is protected, and risks are managed and monitored as we currently do for safety at sea. And I think probably one of the key criterion that we could use to monitor that is this timely relief of crews. And who do I think should address this? Well, I think it's IMO. I look to IMO to take up this challenge, and the maritime community. So I could go on, but I think that sets out my position and what I think as a result of the lessons that we have relearned, not learned because we already knew this, we've relearned them as a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. So to the audience, have a little think about what Claire said, ask your questions. 3 really good points of view there in terms of the things that could be done: length of contract, the physical working environment for seafarers, and reducing the distress and suffering. So please come forward with your comments and questions. Okay, so moving on now, we're going to move to the cruise ship industry, and I'm going to direct a couple of questions at Mateus now. So first of all, the cruise ship industry has really garnered a significant amount of interest during this crisis. What does it look like at the moment?
Well, I've been 20 years in the cruise industry, working with all kinds of projects, and I have to say that, and I think many agree with me, that the cruise industry has gotten somewhat unwanted and unexpected coverage Of course, this is a tremendous strategy, and nobody could have foreseen this. But in terms of tourism, I do not think that the cruise ships are any worse than any other type of tourism. And so a little bit of unfair attention, I think, has been placed on cruise ships. I do think that there are a lot of initiatives out there to see how this can be mitigated, and I think we need to have a completely new view on how we look at different kind of pandemics and pathogens entering the environment where we are supposed to spend our vacation and enjoy ourselves. There will be a lot of focus on mitigation. There will be a lot of focus on evacuation due to the recent events, but I think these are all the items that can be mitigated in the same way as other crises have been mitigated when it comes to technical challenges that the cruise industry has been set forth previously. So I think we need to boil down the problem. We need to look at what are the different kind of strategies that can be implemented, and really engineer the problem into a solution.
Thank you, Mateus. The second part of the question is, what are some of the measures that the cruise industry might adopt going forwards to sort of limit the spread of the virus and other pathogens, because it's not only COVID-19 that affects cruise ships? And how do we reinstall confidence amongst passengers to return back to the industry?
I think there are many different steps that will be taken. There is no silver bullet. This is something that I think we all agree on. There will not be one single item that will solve this problem or any other pathogen, or there will be technologies that are needed, but there will also be need for improvements in procedures. There will be a need in improvements in designs of vessels. We will see a transition period, most likely, where ships will operate in a much different circumstances than they usually would. But in the end, I think that with the right tools and the right planning and basically the right technologies, we can see a blooming and healthy cruise industry evolving after this as well.
Thank you very much, Mateus. So some really interesting thoughts there. I'm sure there's going to be a number of questions from our audience around the cruise ship industry. It is a very focus. There's a lot of public attention and focus always is on the cruise ship industry. So I'm looking forward to some of the questions that we can put towards you, Mateus, and also maybe to Andy and Vasilios, who I know also work in the cruise ship industry, who might be able to help us with some of that. Okay, so moving on now to perspective from the class societies. We're joined by both ABS and Lloyd's today. So first of all, I'm going to pose a question, first of all, to Vasilios and then to Andy. Whilst remote surveys have been carried out for a number of years, the restrictions on movement caused by COVID-19 have seen remote surveys become a necessity. So how are remote surveys working today, and what are the successes and what are some of the difficulties that are yet to be overcome?
So thank you, Kevin. Yes, COVID-19 has certainly affected the shipping industry, but I believe it is the technology that is changing us, not the coronavirus. The coronavirus has given us a push, so to say. It is both a catalyst and an accelerator. In response now to this global pandemic, ABS has accelerated planned investments in remote surveys and the technology underpinning our client-facing offerings. I believe it has also opened eyes in the broad industry as to the viability of conducting operations in a safe and responsible manner, considering our employees' health as well as that of the crews, clients, and other potential exposure points in the chain. In these significant changes, there are also additional benefits, not just in altering now how we service our clients, but in a reduction on our environmental impact and making smarter data-based decisions for alternative means and shifting from the traditional attendance approach by which our industry has operated since set sail. COVID-19 pushed all port state controls, flag administrations, class societies, owners, operators to deal with a dramatic task: how to keep the shipping industry running. In relation to how remote surveys are working today, they are working well. And I think we all recognize the many benefits a remote survey offers. Remote surveys are being conducted globally today and leveraging our strength with a distributed workforce, which may allow us to respond faster than our advertised turnaround time. What really is making remote surveys so successful is the improved efficiency on quality, cost, utilization, and safety. Imagine you have a ship in a remote area and need attendance for a small rectification, so to say. You need to fly people, use service boats, lose time, wait till all happens. That can now be done via remote attendance with a surveyor attending virtually, all without losing the quality of service. In other words, you keep the ship or unit running and you can maintain business continuity. Also, you optimize scheduling efficiencies without losing time. All this happens much faster and again without sacrificing quality. A win-win situation wherever it can be done, however. So here you can see the current ABS remote surveys offerings, so to say. So I give you a picture. ABS and many of our clients are already doing all the listed remote surveys successfully. The feedback received is good and appreciated by owners and operators. As you can see from the list on the slide, ABS are able to offer many remote surveys options: concurrent load line, anytime you need to change over, minor damage survey. Here I need to say that how you define a minor depends on a number of factors to be considered, like its nature, area and size, location, and on how this may affect the safety and seaworthiness of the ship or structure. As you can see here, we can also do dry docking extension survey for up to 3 months, and we can rectify and clear outstanding recommendations and or statutory conditions, continuous machinery survey items, renewal safety radio survey, and underwater inspection in lieu of dry dock or offshore units. I would like at this point to especially address the annual class survey offerings we recently announced in April. We feel ABS takes the industry to the next level, so to say, being the first class society to introduce remote annual class surveys. We're delivering, so to say, the next generation of classification today through surveys conducted anywhere in the world, at any time, without interrupting operation or surveyor attendance. It is a huge step towards, and even more significant changes with scheduling and are to come. As for difficulties now with remote surveys, given the fact that we are taking the industry to the next level, there are barriers we are working through, and we will continue to gain experience and evidence to broaden the scope of our remote survey offerings. Currently, we're focused on non-ESP vessels, less than 15 years of age, and we consider other eligible requirements. ABS has always valued our partnership with flags administrations, and we're working closely with them to offer even statutory annuals.
Okay, thank you, Vasilios. Andy, what's your perspective on remote surveys? How is it working for Lloyds?
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I think our experience to date, really, I would summarize around sort of 5 major themes, which is accuracy and equivalence, the advanced preparation necessity, connectivity and bandwidth, the importance of language, so the balance between global and local, and then collaboration being a key to the success and the future-proofing and adoption. So firstly, around accuracy and equivalence, generally we're exceptionally surprised about the accuracy and equivalence of remote surveys, and we're exceptionally pleased with what we've seen. The quality of images, videos, and live stream communications, especially where enabled with terrestrial networks or high bandwidth VSAT, are very much good enough to compensate for a surveyor's loss of other sensory inputs, and we're excited with what we're seeing around that. Secondly, the importance of advanced preparation. Remote surveys naturally can take longer, there's no question of that. Where we see things working well is where both sides have done their preparation. This is a step change for the industry, whereby in the past surveys would be managed live. It now really becomes important to prepare collaboratively in advance of the actual survey. This can be both a good thing and a challenge, but so long as it's recognized, the jobs can be planned to be the most efficient for all parties concerned. The elephant in the room is still bandwidth. It's very much still a challenge. While VSATs have taken massive step forwards, and I remember working offshore in 1998 to 2004, where we had 9,600 baud rate connections, things have moved forward. But it's certainly still a challenge in terms of data packages are not geared to supporting live streaming functions, and ships tend to be a network Faraday cage. That being said, we've seen some excellent results where enclosed hull surveys, i.e. inside tank inspections, were managed exceptionally well via live stream. Fourthly, I think language, as I say, is exceptionally important. Conducting the surveys in the ship's working language, building on what was said earlier, I think is exceptionally important for integration, understanding, and the well-being of the seafarers as well that are actually on board, that are participating in this, to make them feel truly engaged. Remote communications are exceptionally hard in multilingual, multicultural settings, and working in the same language is a huge help, which means we have to continually address the balance between a local and global dynamic. And then lastly, collaboration, and it was brought up by my previous colleague, I think, in terms of classification and certification are products that are relied upon heavily by a large stakeholder group, certainly larger than those concerned by the contract for classification. So the longevity of remote surveys will be highly dependent on how remote techniques and experience are built in a collaborative manner between all major stakeholders, and we're very much at the forefront of driving that with flag, port state, vetting, insurance, and P&I to name but a few. So I think in summary, there's good and bad and a lot of learning that we can take forward to systemize this around the accuracy and the equivalence, the advanced preparation being vital, connectivity, bandwidth, and how we address that going forward, language being key, and then collaboration is certainly the key to success in the adoption.
Thanks, Andy. To everybody that's listening, you may have experienced remote surveys, so please come in with your questions and your comments. That'd be really valuable. Second question then, back to Vasilios now. What's going to become the norm? What you're doing today, is that going to become the norm? What's the new procedures, regulations, and technologies that maybe have to be developed or adapted to make this happen?
Thanks for the questions, Kevin. So COVID-19 has accelerated the digital transformation of companies. The path of acceleration that we have witnessed in the industry, we feel is here to stay. This will be the new norm, and the transformation pace acceleration will stay at an accelerated path, even if not at the same intensity, so to say. However, technology and artificial intelligence will not replace the human control. For now, we see all technology does is on offer. We see this as tools we can use for better safety and efficiencies. The industry is experiencing several major changes. The impact of regulations and alternative fuels on the carbon journey and the rate of change of technology. This responds to 4 industry challenges: low carbon shipping, the speed and scope of digitalization, the growing cyber threat, and addressing safety risks introduced by the pace of change. And COVID-19 has accelerated all of these processes. We have witnessed new procedures for enhanced worker and asset safety being implemented in companies across the globe. We are also seeing technologies being deployed at a rapid pace, leveraging existing infrastructures like cell phones, hotspots, Bluetooth for tracking, and so on. The path of infrastructure, connectivity, and mobility enhancements to enable remote, virtual, and augmented reviews and inspections, leveraging collaborative inspections and surveys through virtual means is the new norm and here to stay. Yes. Regulations are going to accelerate and become more technology adaptive. We're already seeing this with condition-based inspections, verifications, and leveraging alternative means of verifications through remote surveys. ABS has led this pathway with enhanced remote survey through virtual collaboration, live streaming, maximizing the use of existing hardware. We plan to continue to enhance these capabilities, integrating augmented reality and virtual tagging to continue to lead while minimizing friction in the process. The goal still stays the same: no compromise on safety and quality. The uses of technology in response to COVID-19 contain powerful lessons on digital's potential to drive safety improvement across all levels of an industrial operation, acting as an acid test on a comparatively micro scale of a vessel to a micro scale of a global shipping operation. Thanks.
Thank you, Vasilios. Andy, same question to you. What is going to be the new norm? We'll come back to Andy a little bit later. What I'll do now is I'll have a little talk about technology. And to do this, I'll just share a screen with you a second. So there is a role for technology in the future. What I've done is I've picked out a few different technologies that I think are going to be relevant to the future of maritime under the COVID crisis. So first of all, let's start with robotics. There's a lot of work going on at the moment with hospitals of the future, and some hospitals have been able to deploy robots for delivering food. They can carry medical equipment, they can carry medicines, they can provide information to patients and also to visitors. They've even undertook some of the nursing duties and even undertaken some small therapies like physiotherapy to allow social distancing. And one of the most innovative things that I've seen to date is cleaning of spaces using ultraviolet light. So all of these techniques for using robotics is really to support social distancing or infection control. I'll give you one example. UVD, which is a Danish company, they have developed a cleaning robot using ultraviolet light. It can clean 10 rooms, hospital rooms, over 2.5 hours. And this is something that could potentially be used in a cruise ship and or another type of vessel for cleaning spaces. Alongside that, we've got drones as well, and inspection. It's been used by class societies for inspections. It can also be used for search and rescues and support of coast guards, etc. But it can also be used for the delivery of critical supplies. You can imagine drones being flown to deliver test kits to incoming ships to allow testing to be taken of crews. Another innovation around drones is the ability to maybe disinfect public spaces. And this is where drones that have been used for agricultural purposes could be used to sort of disinfect large areas, so wharf areas, port areas, mass congregations of passengers, even the decks of some ships. And one of the final uses of drones which have been used in China is even for performing temperature checks at a social distance to try and pick out people with high temperatures in big crowds. Another technology that could be useful for social distancing is remote working. So we've all become used to remote working. Every one of us on the call today is undertaking some form of remote working. But why couldn't we take one or two of the roles off of the ship and put that onto the shore? So for instance, if you think of a tugboat that has a chief engineer on board, why couldn't that chief engineer's role be taken across to the shore and be discharged from the shore? That chief engineer could look after more than one tug. It's a better environment for it, and supported by the data, etc., that are coming back, he could be able to give advice to anybody else on board to make interventions as necessary. And lots of contractors are also using remote working. So my own company, we're using remote support for commissioning of equipment, doing remote servicing as best we can to diagnose problems. And this saves us having to transport people around the world, and again, prevents the spread of the infection. Another area that's really innovated in this COVID crisis is 3D printing. Millions and millions of items of personal protective equipment have been produced by 3D printers. And this has resulted in some subtle changes in the technology. People are beginning to think now, how can we adapt current designs of equipment for 3D printing to make it faster, reduce the material that's required for 3D printing, improve the quality? Just to give you an example, GE produced a very simple 3D printed face shield that was designed to work with a hard hat to keep sailors within the US Navy healthy when they work in confined spaces of warships. Now the US Navy is printing these mass by tens of thousands to provide immediate protective gear to all their sailors and Marines anywhere where they've got a 3D printer available on board ships and also on submarines. Another technology which I think is really going to sort of revolutionize the marine industry is the rapid mass tested for COVID-19. So how do you get 4,000 passengers onto a cruise ship? You do that through mass testing. But this is going to require accuracy. It's going to have to be inexpensive, easier to administer, and provide very quick results. So things like rapid antigen tests based upon the lateral flow assay, which is very similar to how pregnancy tests are conducted. This is where antibodies are attached, that get attached to the virus. They show up on two bars on a very little screen. You take a sample from the back of the nasal passage or the throat. It's not a particularly comfortable way of extracting a sample, but it is effective. Now, clearly, we've got to think about false positives and false negatives. So the specificity is the false positives. Generally, a lot of these antigen tests give about 95% sensitivity, specificity. So that means for 4,000 passengers, 200 could be denied boarding because they could be falsely identified as positive. Conversely, we have a sensitivity of rapid testing, and that is false negatives. And again, that could mean 200 people could get on board a cruise ship with 4,000 people on board that could have the disease and could become infectious. Same for a crew of a container vessel. 1 out of 20 could be infectious even with this screening. So the way that it would work is a positive test from the antigen would then result in a follow-up test on a more reliable PCT type test. So this is the polymerase chain reaction. That could take a few hours to come back with a result, or maybe a day to get the results. But this would then mean that you could then board the vessel knowing that you got everybody on board without any sign of infection, and therefore you're starting from a known base, as it were. And you can use this for testing passengers and crew. It could be deployed at ports and also at the exit of ships and crews from those ships as well when they come ashore. Another technology that could be quite useful in ferries and for cruise ships would be contact tracing. So the main technology here is short-range Bluetooth. So this Bluetooth low-energy wireless signals are transmitted by your telephones. Various different protocols have been developed. Some of them are centralized and some of them are decentralized. The ones that are going to be working at sea would be probably the decentralized ones, although it could be connected to a ship's network, and there should be a particular app that runs from that ship to allow us to know who's been in contact with who and what the likelihood of infection would be, or the transmission of infection from anybody that's been on board. So again, this is another sort of enabler that could be used to enable the cruise ship industry to restart and give people confidence. The final technology I'll note, and not a new idea, but for the rapid mobilization of hospital care, hospital ships. These are invaluable for rapidly expanding medical capacity. And when you consider that 2.4 billion people, that's 40% of the world's population, live within 100 kilometers of the coast, then it makes sense maybe for countries around the world to invest in floating hospitals. And in March, in response to the grave healthcare crisis in Italy, the MSC group actually converted one of their ferry ships, the Splendid, into a floating hospital that was equipped for the assistance of patients with COVID-19 and to help those who were convalescing. You may have seen the US NS Comfort, which was dispatched to New York to support the medical teams there. It treated 182 patients over a 3.5-week period. It actually had the capacity for over 1,000 beds on board for treating 1,000 people. And even in the UK, the RFR Argus, which was actually deployed to West Africa in 2015 during the Ebola crisis, was put on standby to act as a backup to help with capacity in the UK. And as you can see, this sort of technology could be very useful for future pandemics or even a second wave of the COVID crisis. So I just wanted to give you sort of an overview of some of the technologies that could play a part in the future of dealing with this pandemic. Really looking forward to your questions, and please use the tool to ask any questions that you like on any of the topics that we covered, from seafarer welfare to the role of class societies, the way that cruise ships could respond to the outbreak, and technology that may help us. So please fire away with any of those questions. You've also got an opportunity to vote on any of the questions that you see there. So please vote if you think any of the questions are interesting. That'll move it to the top of the list. That will get asked earlier. So before we move on, I'm just going to come to Bev, who's our our Director of Policy for the IMarEST, to give us a few words on the crisis.
Thank you, Kevin. I noticed, I think we have Andy back now, so I don't know if you want to ask Andy his second question first and then pop back to me.
Okay, yes, Andy, welcome back.
Thank you.
You froze for a second,
yep.
And so your second question was around what is this going to become the norm, what you're doing today? What new procedures or regulations and technologies might have to be developed and adopted to make this happen?
Thanks very much. I mentioned the word bandwidth and connectivity and then got cut off, so that'll just show us some of the challenges I think we face. But what I was going to say is it's not new. I think in terms of the remote inspection techniques, all of the class societies have been offering this, for many years. I think the acceleration of what we've had to do because of COVID is really what's driving that. Do I see remote surveys becoming the norm? Yes, I think we do. As long as it's delivering any remote survey, that it continues to provide value over and above delivering it conventionally. What do I mean by that? I think it's basically a case of we mustn't forget that people are still key to this. It's still the experts reviewing the inputs and making the decisions based on their experience. Within our organization, which is a slightly different sort of philosophy from some of the others, is that we've set up sort of 16 key maritime hubs around the world, which, as I say, is a slightly different approach. But what we're looking to do is connect our clients in the maritime industry with our technical acumen and know-how without increasing the burden on the maritime community on board the ships. We see technology as an enabler, but not the centerpiece. So very much solutions will be driven by the expertise remotely and across multiple technology platforms. So I think some of the benefit, or some of the, let's say, difficulties that we've faced through COVID that's accelerated the adoption are things that need to be looked at and addressed going forward to make sure that we're not actually just shifting burden from one party to another. But the option of a remote survey in as many scenarios as possible can become the industry norm, and we need to look at that on a case-by-case basis. The technology is there, the experience is rapidly growing, which gives us some options, and options are always a good thing. I think one of the key questions that we need to look at is what role is the regulator going to play in the adoption of remote surveys? So the International Association of Classification Societies, IACS, with its options to offer a recommendation, unified interpretation, unified requirement, or procedural requirement. Our current view is that eventually there will be a role for IACS to play, that it's the first key focus should be in standardizing the minimum scope of activities required in a remote survey across its members. And then remote surveys must be equivalent to the conventional survey, and IACS may need to prescribe the minimum extent of a remote survey, allowing members to compete with the best customer experience, technical experience, technology platforms that deliver this standardized event. But I think, there's a reiteration that people are absolutely key to this, and technology is just is an enabler, not the centerpiece. So we want to make sure that, the experts are still very much connected to, the review and the compliance element of this.
Thank you very much, Andy. We will come back to regulation because there's a few questions that have come up around regulation. So we'll come back to you and Vasilios on that as well. So Bev, your turn.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kevin. I'd like to start by thanking today's panelists. It's been really interesting for me. There's no doubt that COVID-19 has resulted in the maritime industry facing some quite significant challenges, possibly the most challenging period in its history. And whilst we are grappling with the challenge of now, it's been really enlightening to hear some of the ways we can, should, and possibly will adapt. And hopefully shipping will come out of this with a much brighter future. Now, before I hand back to Kevin to take questions from our virtual floor, and I've been watching the Slido and there's numerous questions, so I'll hopefully allow you lots of time. I'd like to quickly cover just 2 points. Firstly, as well as submitting questions today to our panel, we're really keen to hear from you at the IMarEST about your thoughts on what you think the sector might look like in future. So I'd implore anyone listening today, if you have any points you wish to make, no matter how wild, how wacky, as Kevin said, there's no stupid questions and there are no stupid points. Please let us know. There'll be an email address at the end of our events department. You can email anything to them and they'll make sure it reaches myself and my team at the IMarEST. Secondly, as a slightly different point, today we've really focused our debate on shipping. But for those of you who are members, you'll know that we're a multidisciplinary institute. So we're grappling not only with the challenges facing shipping, but with some wider issues. From what's happening in oil and gas through to fisheries. We've seen stories of how the environment is actually recovering slightly, where the activities have lessened, but we've also seen issues in food security. So we're really looking a lot more about how we explore how COVID-19 will impact our ocean future. So a much bigger picture. There have been big consequences this year that we don't really know what's going to happen. We had been, the ocean community, this was the ocean super year. There were really significant events supposed to be happening this year. We had the UN Ocean Conference, which should have been taking place this week, the COP, and also the international negotiations on the legally binding Treaty for the High Seas. And there's the IMO regulation. A lot of this has been delayed, postponed, and we need to understand what consequences that might have in the long term. We're also really keen to look at how there may be some inequalities as a result of this situation. There may be disparities in how women and young people are affected in terms of future jobs and how they're treated, and also how our members and non-members in small island developing states may be particularly impacted and how we deal with that. So the IMarEST is really keen to get to grips with these really big issues. We've got a number of special interest groups and initiatives, projects that are exploring all these issues, and we would love for our members and the wider community to get involved. So the easiest thing to do is, if you're inspired at the end of today, please visit our website, have an explore, and there'll be some more details on there. Again, thank you, the panelists, and also thank you everyone watching today for participating. And I will pass you back to Kevin to start asking our panelists some of these many very interesting questions.
Thank you very much, Bev. Excellent stuff. So we'll come back and remind everybody about what you said towards the end. Let's start with the first question. And actually, I think we can ask most of the panelists this one. So this one is the favourite at the moment at the top of the question list. Maritime regulation is often slow to be adopted. Do you think the current situation will force a rethink on how regulation could be developed quicker? So I think I'll start with Claire on this one, please.
Sorry, that's a challenging question. Yes, it is tortoise-like in its speed, isn't it? The way that the international community negotiates changes in legislation that affects it all. I'm probably not best placed to answer that because I'm not legally, I'm not a lawyer, but I think, yeah, perhaps what we need to focus on is the evidence base and drive legislation changes from evidence and science. Much we have done, we've seen our countries follow the science in managing the COVID-19 outbreak. I think that would be my choice of ways in which we could improve how legislation is made and the effectiveness of legislation as well. Whether or not it would speed it up, I don't know.
Let's come to the class societies. So Vasilios, what's your view on the speed at which regulation changes? This directly impacts you guys. So how could we make it quicker?
Okay, it was always a challenge, regulations, but perhaps also the philosophy of humanity to follow the technology. This becomes even more of a challenge because the technology is moving even faster nowadays. But I have to say, during COVID-19, we saw some positive signs. I can name one, for instance. There are some flag administrations that allow us, class societies, we're acting on behalf of the flag administrations, right? So they allowed us to issue a force majeure or a further extension to the certification of the vessel because of a justified reason, coronavirus, attendance, availability, and so on, which shows to me a fast response, and it is taking as a positive sign that the regulatory framework can really be better, adapting faster and follow the technology there. With challenges, but it can be done.
Andy, your perspective.
Thanks, Kevin. I think it comes back to the stakeholder collaboration piece again. I think, we have seen IMO and IACS certainly, act quicker during this, situation. I was going to say collectively as the class societies are leading the drive to try and maintain those critical global supply chains during the pandemic, as Vasilios was talking about in terms of some of those examples of, extensions, etc. And I think we've all sort of said that actively and focused support of IMO's recommendations for ensuring that, shipping services and seafarers can deliver those vital goods critical to responding and overcoming the pandemic. So, moving forward, I think we've got to see more of that collaborative approach. And we'll certainly be focused on encouraging the regulators and the other ROs to act more effectively, consistently and quickly by establishing, uniform approaches for properly evidenced postponements of classification and statutory surveys on ships. And I think, lastly, it is really, again, collaboratively working with the flags, like we are with, for example, with the MCA, so the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency in the UK to try and drive these changes through, including publishing pragmatic guidance for operators and seafarers. And it's also about working, to consider a consistent approach across the regulators to expedite the necessary changes. So bringing them together, in a forum to make sure that we address the issues collaboratively.
Thank you, Andy. Different question now for Mateus. Coming back to the cruise ship industry, whether or not HVAC systems have contributed to the spread of the virus on cruise ships is a big debate. But do you think improvements are needed in this area?
I think the improvements will be needed, and I think improvements will be provided. There is still a lot of debates, like you said, about what technologies, how it could be improved. But I think in general there has been. We cannot take focus from the goal that has been the previous norm to look at energy efficiency, for example. By looking at energy efficiency, we have introduced different kind of ways with air conditioning systems, and this has to still be a high priority because we still need to continue to be green, even though we aim for being very safe as well. So what technology will be applicable? There are numerous technologies out there, but I think we need to be both green and safe when we re-enter the industry.
Okay, thank you, Mateus. To Andy and Vasilios, and we'll start with Andy, a little bit of skepticism in the audience about, do you really believe that remote surveys and audits have the same value and impact as physically having a surveyor on board the vessel? Start with you, Andy.
So I think it probably semi goes to the second half of the question that we were asked before. So I think in certain circumstances, yes, there is the equivalence that we have to have, as to provide the necessary compliance checks. I think there is still, a long way to go, and I think that's why, for us, I think, as I said, it's about connecting people. So it's very much still around the experts reviewing the inputs and making the decisions based on their experience. And we see technology, I'm going to say, as the enabler, not at the absolute center of the decisions that we're making. So it really is about connecting remotely the expertise, within, the various stakeholders across the world to make sure that that equivalence can be provided. But certainly in terms of some of the intermediate surveys that we provide, I would say, and the lion's share of the majority of the remote surveys that have been done to date around machinery and hull damage, general examinations for postponements and statutory deficiencies, those we feel as though we've had absolutely the necessary equivalence to provide those remotely. And then I think as we move forward and we start working with more of the flag states, and we start looking at continuous hull, continuous machinery survey cycles, load line surveys, etc., those are where we have to build up the confidence again through the imagery or the technology that's available to provide the equivalence. So it's a case-by-case basis, and it's situational dependent, depending on when we can adopt some of these technologies or surveys.
Thanks, Andy. Vasilios, your view? Do you want to come off mute?
Sorry again. So as I said before, nothing can replace the human. That's one. But I want to be very pragmatic here, so I will give you two examples. And then I go to my point. So do you know nowadays, if a glass society does annual surveys, but the life raft, one life raft is out of service, this glass society cannot complete the annual surveys? Cannot. The owner has to repair, to service it, and the surveyor has to go back again on board to make sure this is done. Why you cannot do this? You cannot do this by remote, by verifying. You can do it, and I think it's logical that you can do it. On the other hand, if you have a big damage inside the tank, and the tank is dirty, and you need to clean, and how much clean, and how much dirty, and where is the decision, and how much I have to crop out, etc. Obviously, you need a human being on board to make a decision. So I gave these two examples to come to my point. Yes, can be done. can be good, sometimes can be even better. You'll be very surprised of the quality a drone flying inside the tank can give you. Can give you outstanding quality of a picture, even better than the human eye. But we can use it with common sense, step by step, and with logic. Yes, we can use it. Excellent.
Thank you, Vasilios. Claire, lots and lots of questions on the seafarer. Let me just start with a couple of them. A recent study indicates that the safety management system is mostly a paper exercise. So how do we ensure any measures taken to improve seafarers' mental health doesn't just become another tick box exercise?
Good question. Well, I think from what I understand as a psychologist, it's consequences drive behavior. And I think perhaps some would argue that the ISM code is toothless because the consequences of not managing safety properly are uncertain and they may not eventuate. So I think we need as a community to be monitoring what happens on a much wider scale, and there needs to be unfortunately there needs to be enforcement of these issues. And I think that if companies don't manage welfare, then there needs to be consequences, and that might be not just the wrath of the port state inspector, it might be commercial consequences. So certainly during the pandemic, there's been lots of discussions with charterers about relieving crew, and it's gratifying to see that charterers are now starting to put seafarers' welfare at the top of the agenda, and therefore allowing shipping companies, operators to deviate their voyages to relieve crews. So consequences, in a nutshell, it's the consequences that drive the effectiveness of safety management system. If there are no consequences, then they will do what they can get away with.
Thanks, Claire. I'm going to sort of pose this question first of all to you, Claire, and then I'll come back to Andy and Vasilios. And I'll just read out the question as it comes up, because it's clearly somebody who's concerned about seafarers, and they've just said, isn't concern with respect to seafarers' stress and inadequate rest hours pure hypocrisy when you want to add remote surveys to their workload?
So, yeah, I think one of the things that we perhaps haven't done as an industry, or we don't have the framework in which to address some of these issues, is, as I set out in my piece for Maritime Chirp, is we need to look at the demands of the job on seafarers. And we know from research in the health psychology domain, in the occupational health domain, that there are characteristics of jobs that have negative consequences for people's mental well-being. And some of these are the job demands. So the amount of work, the speed of which they have to work, the risk associated with the work. And so I think we need to adopt a framework in order to which maybe review legislation, but also to review as part of a risk assessment, which would be required as part of a management system. You risk assess what you're asking people to do to see what the consequences are likely for their mental health. So so a framework looking at job demands and assessing the risks and acting accordingly would be my advice to counter what might be seen as hypocrisy.
Okay, Vasilios, you're going to put more stress onto seafarers with remote surveys.
Okay, the remote surveys It's a very good question, and I'm happy that somebody is asking this question. We don't do this to put more stress or to create more job for the people, especially the people on board. We do it to create less job and less stress. And the remote survey does not need at all to happen during the sleeping hours or the resting hours of the crew on board. Why? No need at all. We can adjust it and we can do it whenever convenient for the crew. And again, please remember, it is not the gun that's killing somebody, it's us, it's the human beings. So we have available technology, it's up to us how to use it to our benefits. When I say to our benefits, to the crew benefits as well, of course, to start with, actually, with the crews. So I don't see us necessarily as we're creating extra job. In contradiction, I would argue we're creating less job.
Okay, good. Andy, your view.
Yeah, no, look, I would agree with that. I think it's basically a case we are actually looking to, you know, in the surveys that we are promoting to be done remotely and we'll be looking at into the future is actually to reduce the burden of the, you know, the survey process on the operations of the ship, which is obviously directly impacted into the individuals that will be carrying out those surveys. And I think that's why we deliberately haven't sort of, I'm going to say, published a list of everything that's available, because we want to do what is right for the industry around value-added services right the way through, you know, the crew, through class, into the, you know, wider stakeholders as well, to be able to provide that necessary equivalence. And I think that list is growing all the time, but the success of the survey very much depends on the situation, you know, sort of extensively, so could actually be misleading because it has to work for everybody to make it make sense. So it's absolutely not the intention to, you know, introduce any extra burden which could sort of impact the well-being of seafarers.
Is there a role for technology here? So we see in the medical arena where artificial intelligence is used to improve diagnostics for patients. Is that something that could be used in remote surveys to sort of unburden the crew and help you do your job better?
Absolutely. I think, you know, if you take the machinery plan maintenance systems, for example, and the way that those are moving forward, and those can very much move from, you know, a survey type environment into something that is actually digitally enabled through dashboards, through sensorization from, you know, the CMMS systems on board ships. So that again is potentially, you know, taking away, which is what we're looking to do, value added services from not just the, you know, the owner operator on the, you know, financials of an organization, but also from the individuals that are actually operating the ships in terms of the seafarers. So technology, if used properly to solve the problem, I think it has a huge place in the maritime industry. I think where we've got to be careful is solutions looking for the problem. You know, so I think it is absolutely about design, you know, defining what those problems are that we're trying to solve, and whether those are overwork, whether those are stress related, or whether those are operational expenditure related. And then, you know, as I say, collectively work on what those solutions look like. And machinery plan maintenance is a classic example of where we can use those technologies hand in glove with classification to unlock huge benefits for clients.
Thanks, Andy. Mateus, I've noticed we haven't asked you a question for a few minutes. Coming back to cruise ships, do you foresee any permanent changes to the way that cruise ships are designed, particularly the interior layouts in the wake of the pandemic, you know, to create sort of socially distant spaces or quarantine areas? Have you put any thought into this area?
There has been a lot of thought, and I think that's the analysis that everybody is doing now on cruise ships. And when we look at the cruise ships, how they are built today and how they will be built in the future, I think we need to look at first at the areas. We need to look at the areas, how they are built up, but then we also need to look at the flows through the areas, because I mean, we know that the virus sticks to surfaces, but we also need to evaluate all the flows through those specific areas. And I think that's where the design changes will happen. It might be a flow of luggage on board a vessel. It might be a flow of persons through a terminal on board a vessel. It might be waste coming off a vessel. So I think looking at the areas and the flows, that will be the key for defining how the vessels will be built in the future.
Thank you, Mateus. Claire, a question that's come up that's quite popular here. It said, how would you say COVID-19 has affected the intake of new seafarers at the junior level?
Good question. I'm not 100% sure. We know that that mental ill health amongst young people is certainly a cause for concern. We know that separation from families is a key problem for seafarers and causes them distress. And we know that some of the problems that we have with cadets and trainees is that they don't stay at sea because they can't cope with the separation from their families. So in terms of the impact on recruitment, I think only time will tell whether or not it's had any, if people have been put off by what they've heard, maybe for the cruise ship industry, that might have some consequences. But I know that companies are now screening people, because what we don't know is, are seafarers naturally more vulnerable to these mental ill health problems before they even go to sea? So I know that companies are starting to screen people for vulnerabilities just for protection of themselves, really. This isn't an environment that would be good for them. But yeah, I think to come back to the question is, I think only time will tell whether it affects our ability to recruit people into the industry.
Okay. Pretty good question that's come up here is, a ship by definition is pretty well socially distanced if it's at sea for many months. And even if the crew have suffered COVID-19, it may be that they've now moved out of being infectious. So until it reaches port, you haven't got a risk of infection. But what could be done? What sort of technology could be used on a port visit to sort of minimise the impact on both the people at land and also the people on the ship from COVID-19? Any thoughts on that one? So I'll ask this to everybody. So first of all, to you, Claire.
Well, I think I probably would bounce it back to you, Kevin, and the sorts of things that you were running through in your presentation about what technologies can be used that have been sort of fast tracked, shall we say, through the experiences with the COVID pandemic. Certainly, I know that where are the periods of greatest risk for the seafarers is when they take on board pilots. And they have people coming on board who are of an unknown virus risk, and certainly sort of personal protective equipment is key to protecting both them and their visitors. But also, I liked something that I heard on a recent news broadcast: PPB. Personal protective behavior. And I think that, I think what we can learn from the pandemic to protect people and communities, whichever way they're going, is to look at the behavior that people are involved. And so I think when it comes to preventing infections, the things that we've all been taught, the mantras about hand washing for 20 seconds and social distancing and these sorts of things are probably things that we should carry forward now. They should become the new norm, I think.
Mateus, any thoughts on technology at the port which could help minimise the cross-infection from ship to shore, shore to ship?
I think interception is probably the key, but I really like Claire's comment on the PPB. That sounds like behavior is something that we really need to look at for sure. But the interception of the spread is of course something that we really need to focus on as well, where PPB would most likely be the most efficient one. But there is of course a lot of discussions about what medical facilities does the port need to have in the transition also, and I think that will be very interesting to see the next spins on. But I do agree with Claire. PPB is probably the way forward.
Thank you. Vasilios, any thoughts on technology at the port?
Nothing I can add to what was said already. Nothing really I can add.
Okay.
I don't want to repeat myself again by saying the remote surveys, whenever possible, does help here.
Andy, any views?
No, I was going to say, I'm going to reiterate what I think Claire said. I think it was brilliant. I think there's two great suggestions. The ISM code for well-being as well, which is something I'd love to sort of get involved in, I think, on a personal level, but also a company level. But also the same here, I think. You know, seafarers have been stuck. I think it's as simple as that. So, you know, what we're seeing now, we shut down airports. And, you know, as we were talking, Kevin, before, we're looking at how do we safely open airports now in terms of not having to quarantine for 2 weeks, etc. That needs to be rapidly accelerated into whatever infrastructure that we need to put into ports to ensure that we can actually manage the throughput of personnel onto and off ships as fast as possible to alleviate some of the issues that have been faced.
Yeah, I think, as I said in my piece, I think testing is really the sort of liberator here. Airports are now looking at it. If you go to Hong Kong now, you will be made to wait in a waiting area for several hours after your tests have been taken. But I think testing is speeding up, and the accuracy, the sensitivity and specificity of the testing is becoming more accurate. And I think that will be the way in which you know, you'll enable ports to become sort of clean areas where you know that people are probably pandemic free or virus free when they enter a ship or they come off of a ship, as it were. I think that's probably the biggest enabler, on top of, as you say, the general hygiene behaviours that everybody has. Okay, coming back to Claire, should we review the manner in which seafarers are employed? You know, instead of employing them on a single voyage contract, why not revert to a continuous service contract?
Yeah, I think we don't really know what the impact or whether there are benefits with continued open-ended contracts versus these short-term voyage-only contracts. Certainly from a financial point of view and financial security, then certainly an open-ended contract is far better for people. And there are arguments for having, you know, a workforce that is not outsourced or managed by external agencies. You know the quality of that workforce, you have a much closer relationship with that workforce, they identify with you as an employer, rather than it being unclear who is actually responsible for their employment contract. And I think so there are, for the seafarer, there's certainly a lot of pluses for having a permanent open-ended form of contract. But for the employer, the owner, the operator, then it hampers their ability to adjust their workforce in terms of the numbers. And there's long been debates about how you manage your workforce. You know, going back to the time of the last sort of big recession in the UK, about whether you have a core of quality seafarers that are on these, you know, supreme contracts, the gold standard contracts, and then the rest of the workforce is on these more contingent, flexible forms of employment. And I think maybe there's a time now to review that. Certainly from a point of view of what's ethical to do, what's equitable to do, in terms of treating what we've seen in shoreside industries about the importance of our lowest paid workers, you know, in terms of keeping society functioning. You know, from care staff working in care homes to the people that are doing all the deliveries to the people working in the shops. Maybe as society, we need to start valuing these people who are at the lower ends of the food chain much, much more. And we need to think about the impact of their contingent, insecure, lives has on their well-being and the well-being of their communities. It's not just them, they often have extended families. So yeah, I suppose having said that, you know, there's no real sort of one way or the other in terms of what's coming out from research, but certainly personally I think that a more permanent employment relationship is beneficial.
Thank you. Mateus, have you got any indication from your customers of how long it will take the cruise ship industry to recover back to the sort of the pre-norm of COVID, the 2019 norm, or maybe the new norm? Any views there?
I think it's a very difficult question. So I think the highest efforts are being placed now in the safeguard of the passengers and reassuring the passengers that they can get back into this fantastic way of spending your vacation. So I think we're still in too early stage to see when the bounce back will be completed, when it will be fully back. I think we will see the cruise industry get back in full speed for sure, but I think it's too early yet to say what the time frame will be.
Okay. A question for Vasilios. Should the IACs have a common standard for remote survey inspection to sort of ensure quality for the ship owners?
Yes, ideally speaking, yes, it should have a common position. Yes.
And are they working towards that as a group at the moment?
There are panels, there are working efforts going on, but we have to see also that various classification societies moving with different speeds and different investments in this direction. But I want to be positive and optimistic. Yes, we have to have a common approach. We have to work hard on this. And the work is being done already as we speak.
Andy, how quickly do you think that the IATS can get its act together and get this sort of common standard out?
So we are all working towards that, is what I would say. So I'd reiterate what Vasilios is saying in terms of the working groups that are trying to sort of, you know, work out what the new normal looks like. And then there are the number of operations that, or number of sort of options that are available, as I sort of indicated before, on recommendations, unified interpretations, unified requirements, or procedural requirements. So those working groups are ongoing at the moment, and I would envisage, you know, within the next, you know, periods that would be something that we would look to get out as a sort of a standard, you know, sort of approach to the industry. And it's essential so that we avoid the confusion associated with what is available and what isn't available from individual sort of, let's say, entities.
And Vasilios, does there need to be any investment by ship owners to facilitate remote surveys?
Yes. To start with, at the stage we're now, not much, really. But if we want to really expand, to make it really big, to involve also the statutory annuals, as I mentioned before, and being able to make decisions on the spot, we need some investments. And there are companies and investors that are working in this direction. I can give an example. The live streaming is an issue. Okay, but you need the live streaming to make decisions on the spot. That's an investment required, just an example. So yes, investments will be required. It's coming with a big acceleration, what is coming in front of us. It is coming. Don't forget the 5G. 5G technology is not just 100 times faster. It's about the connectivity. So this means you have somebody in Houston who is operating a drone in China, and the reaction from the time he pushes the button till the drone reacts is actually microseconds. This is a big revolution, the connectivity that is in front of us, that will boost everything really.
Okay. We're just coming to the very end now. I just wanted to give each of you maybe a minute just to sort of maybe answer a question that's not been asked today, or just close up with a few final remarks. Just start with you, Claire. Anything that you want to sort of close with, or any questions that you think haven't really been answered today?
Well, I think, I don't know about any questions that haven't been answered. Nothing springs to mind, put it that way. But just thinking and listening to you all and the questions that have come through. And I think going back to perhaps the first one about speeding up how regulations get put on the statute books. And I was listening to Vasilios and Andrew primarily talking about collaboration. And I think perhaps for too long now, our industry has been adversarial. You know, it's charter against operator, it's one nation against another, it's deregistered, you know, so open registers against traditional registers. And I think perhaps now what our response to COVID has shown, or the international maritime community's response to COVID has shown, is where there's a will, there's a way. And maybe it's, you know, the cliche, you know, necessity is the mother of invention. But perhaps what we can learn from what has happened is that we're all on the same side, really. And that, you know, collaborative working, bringing all of this expertise in the different sectors of the industry together, we can have huge impact on the decency of work, the effectiveness and the efficiency of the industry, and the safety of all those concerns. So that's what I take away from what we've discussed today.
Thank you very much, Claire. Mateus, any final views from your perspective as a contractor to the cruise ship industry?
I would also agree that the collaborative approach, that's something that I think we have seen already, that there is a high grade of collaboration across the industries, and it will be it's just a necessity. We really need to collaborate towards this common obstacle that we have in front of us. I think we will emerge wiser and with a better industry after COVID. But collaboration will for sure be the only remedy for getting through it. So,
Vasilios, any closing remarks from you?
Perhaps as I'll say, of course, I agree with collaboration, and we all together we are powerful and we can achieve stuff. I agree that the regulatory framework has to move faster. Solas is talking still about key laying. There is no key laying anymore for the last 40 years. You don't lay a flat bar at the bottom. There's block laying, yes, in Korea and China, but there's no key laying. But one of the most significant, remarkable dates in Solas is key laying. So, Jesus, yes, it needs to accelerate faster. I'm positive COVID-19, as I said, showed that if necessity is there, as Claire mentioned, yes, things can move faster. We shall see it, learn from this, and accelerate. Not to be afraid of technology that is coming, as long as we can use it to our benefit with logic and common sense.
Thank you very much, Vasilios. Andy.
Well, firstly, thank you to yourself and the rest of the panelists and everybody for the questions. I think in terms of the summary, I think well-being and safety are absolutely interlinked. And I think that is, you know, a key consideration that we have to take forward. Technology is an enabler, you know, in terms of how that can help us increase the benefits to both well-being and to safety. I think the collaborative approach, obviously, that's being stated by everybody is absolutely critical, not just for moving forward through the rest of the pandemic, but also to move on to, or back to, let's say, bringing key on the agenda on decarbonisation. And moving forward in that direction.
Great, thank you very much. Well, look, everybody, I'd just like to say on behalf of the Institute, thank you very much to our panelists today. So Claire Packham, Vasilios Christoulias, Andy McCarran, Mattias Aronson. We've had a great debate today. I've still got 34 questions on the panel in front of me, which I haven't got time to ask you all. And to everybody that's been listening today, thank you for your tremendous questions and the points of view that you've made. We really enjoy it. Coming back to what Bev says, we're really interested as an institute in terms of what will the future look like post-COVID-19. We also want to hear about your experiences. We want to hear about the difficulties in your particular part of the marine engineering and science world, as it were, especially around, you know, inequalities, what's happening to women, what's happening to younger people, what's happening to people in the smaller Pacific Islands. Anything like this, we're very interested to hear what you have to say, and you can email us directly. But on behalf of the Institute, I want to close today's webinar. Thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you very much to yourselves. And I wish you all stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.